Jackson and I'm Deputy CEO of the Climate Institute.
And I'm Will McGoldrick, Policy and Research Manager at the Climate Institute.
Will and I will be the Climate Institute's team in Cancun, and over the next couple of weeks we'll be giving you video blogs of the events as they unfold in Cancun and offering some analysis of what's actually happening at the international meeting. But before we actually get into the details of what might happen in Cancun, I thought it would be useful to provide some context, because against the backdrop of the meeting in Mexico, we are actually seeing an unprecedented level of global action on the domestic front. So we're seeing countries like the EU, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, New Zealand, all implementing policies to limit and either directly or indirectly price pollution. For example, the Climate Institute recently released a report, a groundbreaking report that examined, if you added up all the renewable energy targets, the subsidies, the emissions trading systems, the carbon taxes in a range of countries, what you saw was that countries like China and the UK, and even the United States and Japan, have already moved ahead of Australia in terms of its direct and indirect pollution policies and making its businesses responsible for the pollution they cause. So while we'll have a lot of focus on the international meeting over the next couple of weeks, it's important to remember that action around the world is occurring and Australia is in no risk of being left behind. And this will be an important political context for the government when it goes to the Cancun meeting, because Australia has already committed internationally to reduce its pollution by 5 to 25% on 2000 levels by 2020, but it currently doesn't have any policies in place that would actually allow it to achieve even the most minimum of those targets. So politically, our influence will be diminished at that international forum, because countries like China and other places will be able to look at us and say, we are actually doing more to constrain our pollution levels in real absolute terms, or even on an intensity basis than you are. So the other important thing to remember about Cancun is that it's about actually locking in and building on progress since Copenhagen. There's been a lot of commentary about the success or failures of Copenhagen, and certainly it didn't meet a lot of people's expectations. But what we did see in Copenhagen was a foundational agreement that could be potentially turned into a more robust international regime, which would allow countries to go even further in the actions that they're taking. So the final point to make is that, before Will jumps on and starts talking about the details that might be actually built on from the Copenhagen Agreement, is that international agreements ultimately aren't about reducing emissions. That's the role of national governments. It's the national policies that countries put in place to meet their targets that will determine whether we avoid the worst impacts of accelerating climate change and deal with pollution. What international negotiations are ultimately about is actually facilitating and building the trust and the architecture that we need internationally for countries to go further than they would have if they didn't have those international agreements. So it's about accelerating the already substantial action that we've currently got to ensure that we avoid the worst impacts of dangerous climate change.
Thanks. Yes, I think, as Erwin said, in Copenhagen last year we got effectively it was a political deal on some of the core issues that need to be resolved to enhance and enable strong action on climate change. Now, that was a political agreement, and the challenge for negotiators this year has been to try and turn that political agreement into a more solid legal foundation, essentially. So to flesh out what was agreed in Copenhagen into a more substantial set of agreements and set of decisions which countries can clearly interpret and understand exactly what they're committing to. Not surprisingly, the first start of this year there was a lot of focus on different interpretations of the Copenhagen Accord. So this year has been focused on trying to arrive at a common set of interpretations and understandings, and hopefully in Cancun the aim is to lock in and provide some more details around some of those key elements. And this has been described as a balanced package, or a balanced package of outcomes from Cancun. And our understanding is that there's a lot of goodwill to achieve that balanced package of outcomes. It will be difficult, as everyone would have seen in Copenhagen. These negotiations are not easy. But I think the intention here is to isolate 6 or so issues which can realistically be resolved essentially in Cancun. And then there'll be some more contentious issues which will need to be resolved next year, and some of them may need to be resolved in an ongoing fashion. But those 6 key issues include things like establishing a new global climate fund. So in Copenhagen, the developed world committed to initially $30 billion worth of finance, and then an ongoing scaling up to about $100 billion by 2020. So the challenge this year in Cancun is to establish that fund where that money can, or some of that money at least, can start flowing into and be dispersed to help developing countries reduce their dependence on pollution. So that's one of the key outcomes that Cancun can achieve. Another one is establishing a mechanism to protect tropical forests. Again, I think there's a lot of goodwill. There's a few sticking points, but a lot of goodwill and a lot of, I suppose, shared interest in getting that framework established. This will help countries like Indonesia, Brazil and some African countries and other countries in the Pacific region to manage their forests better to protect those carbon stores. Another key issue will be establishing a global system to support resilience and adaptation in developing countries who are on the front line. This will be important for Pacific Island countries and other developing vulnerable countries. A decision on technology cooperation is also hoped for in Cancun. And one of the key ones as well that we hope to see addressed in Cancun is locking in the current targets the countries are committed to internationally. And that includes, as Erwin said, Australia's target of between 5 to 25% of 2000 levels. Now, everyone recognises that globally the aggregate level of all those targets from all the different countries needs to be stronger, so we need to do more. But we also need to lock in what we've got at the moment and make sure that they're fully recognised within the UN system as being the sort of starting point of ongoing negotiations around targets. So the intention is to formally acknowledge all those targets, and that didn't happen in Copenhagen. They were put on the table in Copenhagen and they were adopted as part of the accord, but they weren't formally endorsed as such or adopted by the UN. And related to that, very closely related to that, is this idea of increasing and improving transparency at the international level. So countries have said not only will they meet their targets, they'll also open up their books and show the rest of the world that they are really meeting their targets, that they're doing what they said they'd do. And so I think Cancun provides an opportunity to elaborate some of those commitments that were made in Copenhagen, to flesh out the procedures for improving transparency. So that sounds like a fairly long list, but in reality it's important to remember that in the dying days of the Copenhagen negotiations, a lot of those issues were very close to being resolved. There were some key sticking points, but countries had actually come a long way since Bali, which was now 3 years ago, to reach agreement on those 6 or so issues. And so this year has really been about getting back to the nuts and bolts. It's been more of a sort of, I suppose, focused set of negotiations without that expectation that they were to produce the final deal this year. I think everyone would have liked to have seen that, but the reality was we needed to take the pressure off a little bit and focus on some of the key issues where we can lock in agreement, and then move towards next year some of the more contentious issues.
So there's sort of our rough guide to Cancun. As I said, we'll be blogging over the next few weeks to sort of give updates on the progress that's been made on those issues and more broadly within negotiations, and also probably fleshing out and explaining some of the contentious issues that inevitably will turn up in the press as countries play media diplomacy. But hopefully you'll come back and look at what we've got to say over the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thanks.